How's it going, guys? In this tutorial, I'm gonna walk you through this project in Blender. We're gonna create this living room from start to finish, and I'm gonna show you some pretty interesting lighting and shading techniques. If you want to check out the project files for this tutorial, go to my Patreon link in the description below. So let's actually get into the tutorial. This tutorial is actually based on a real product ad from IKEA, and I put the link to this project down below, so I'm using that as my reference for this tutorial. First off, we start by blocking out the scene, which means using primitive typology and primitive meshes to recreate a rough shape of our scene. I'm entering very specific size values for my couch in this case. I looked it up on the IKEA website, and I put the same in for the floor as well. A great tip to get you started. Use real measurements to make the scene look more accurate. The same is true for the height of the room and all the other things. Especially in architectural and interior renderings, this will look a whole lot better. Now I'm adding in the camera. I'm positioning the camera at a reasonable height, so something like 1 to 2 meters I think should look good. I'm increasing the focal length a bit to compress the perspective a bit more, because I think this makes everything look a bit more professional. And now I'm adding slowly more and more geometry using simple quads and simple cubes for my scene, cutting out holes. Before I go to stage number 2, which is lighting. It comes pretty early in this case. I'm using this HDR image to light the scene. HDR eyes give a very realistic look, because they not only add light, which has a very high dynamic range, but they also add color and variation. So this is a pretty cool technique. As well as this one, especially for interior renderings, try to increase the light paths, especially in the diffuse range. So if you have got more light paths to work with, the light bounces more often through your scene, which makes everything look more real and brighter especially. And the shadows are not as dark as with the default 4 or 8 light paths. So make sure to play around with that. It increases render times though, so be aware of that. For the lighting in this scene, I've got my main sun lamp, which is pretty strong at the moment. And yeah, now you can really see the effect this lamp has on my scene. Let's have a look at that in final rendered form. I like to have a look at these things quite early on, because this gives more, it gives me more information about how the final scene will look like. For more diffuse lighting, I added in some area lights, which are pretty large in size and not as strong as the main key light. And I did so twice. So we've got some different area lamps here, which are also pretty large. So now let's focus on a pretty nice technique, which is adding gobos in front of your sun lamp to block out some of the light, to make it look as if the light shines through a tree, for example. And these are these so-called lighting gobos. It's pretty simple topology, which is actually put in front of your light. And if we compare the before and after, you can really see that this adds a kind of a light texture. I've created one of these gobos, which is basically a simple plane, which I scaled up and added some geometry to it, added some edge loops. And with the select random feature, I selected some random faces, deleted them, and now you can use this to block out some of the light. In these cases, I've added a texture onto some planes, which is basically a simple Musgrave texture fed through a color ramp to crush the blacks and to crush the whites. And this again is fed into a mix shader, which mixes between a transparent and a diffuse shader. And wherever it's black, it's a pass-through, and wherever it's light, it's opaque. And you can put that in front of the sun too. So we've got our lighting set. Let's model some of the objects. Let's start with the couch first. Important here is it has a very geometric shape, so it shouldn't be too rough and look too much like a real cloth. It should be quite geometric. That's why I'm starting off with a simple cube, beveling the edges by pressing Ctrl B, moving some edge loops to create a harsher edge below and a softer gradation to the top, and then applying this modifier and scaling my mesh on the X and Y axes to give it kind of this pillow-like shape. And then using the grab brush as well as the cloth brush in Blender's editor in combination with the multi-resolution modifier to give some more details to my mesh, especially on the parts where you have got a lot of stress on the material, especially the corners and the sides and the edges. Try to add some detail there. It looks very real. Now, I duplicated all of these meshes and gave each of them a bit of variation. You can use these meshes again in for these back parts right here. And now I'm adding in this this bottom part again with the same technique as before. And in a matter of a few minutes, you've got yourself a pretty nice couch. As for this outer part, I'm now going to show you a pretty helpful technique to create these edge creases. So apply your subsurf modifier, select one of these edges and bevel the edge, and extrude the edges inwards by pressing Alt-E to extrude along the normals, and reinforce these edge loops again by beveling them. You don't need a subdivision surface modifier applied to get this much detail, but it is a really cool technique, especially if you're working with furniture. It really helps a lot to make this look real. Now let's take a look at this pillow. Basically the same thing. We start off with a cube and scale the edges, only the edges, into kind of this star-like shape. Before we go in, add in a multi-resolution modifier and again go into the sculpting mode using the crease brush, adding some creases along the sides, giving it some variation. And with the grab brush, you can grab these corners and pinch them outside to create this kind of pillow shape. And now let's just pinch the edges a bit and you've got yourself a pretty nice pillow. As a quick reminder, if you go to patreon.com/rescan, you will get access to my project files for this and all the other tutorials. So make sure to subscribe there, patreon.com/rescan. And now let's go back to the tutorial. Now I'm showing you how to use cloth simulations to create a small little blanket on our couch. We're now going to create a plane which we're going to drop from on the couch, and we're using some collider meshes like these boxes right here to collide it with the couch basically. And we're using that as a starting point to sculpt our cloth into shape later on. So now let's add in a small little plane, add a lot of geometry because we need to now add the cloth modifier to that. And as you see here, we add the collision modifier to all the other boxes. We now get a pretty solid cloth simulation. You can add in a bit more detail to the blanket as well as the colliders to get a more realistic simulation. As you see me doing here, I'm adding in some randomness, some randomness along every axis, using proportional editing to do so. And now I think this is a pretty good starting point. Now let's go to the modifiers tab, apply our simulation, and we now take a look at our cloth. We can smooth it a bit out, add in a solidify modifier right here, make it a bit more thick, and now let's go into the sculpt mode, add in a subdivision surface or multi-resolution modifier, and use the draw brush, basically the blob brush is pretty helpful, and the cloth brush to sculpt your cloth. Pretty easy and pretty nice technique to get you started. Okay, now next up will be the carpet. Pretty easy here as well. It's just a simple plane with a solidify modifier and a displacement modifier on top. This displacement modifier right here is used in this case. It's very softly applied, so not too much, but it adds the necessary irregularities to the carpet to make it look real. It's just a simple cloud texture, pretty large size, and not a lot intensity. You can see how this looks if I X-aggregate it a bit. Pretty easy. And as for these parts here, it's just simple cubes with a bit of topology added with an array along the sides of a carpet. And I put the same basically displacement modifier on top, increased the strength a lot and made the size pretty large to give this a bit more randomness. Yeah, again, and I think it looks pretty good. Now let's look at our bookshelf. And especially let's look at the books inside of them, inside of the shelf first, and how we got a lot of variation there and how to easily create a lot of these in a matter of minutes. Just start off again with a simple cube, model one book basically by beveling the edges right here, and then go in, add a bevel modifier on top to make some edges that catch some light. Unwrap the topology and use a simple book texture like this one right here and apply it on top of our mesh. Make sure the UV mapping matches according to your book texture. Let's have a look at this in textured view, and yeah, let's place the UV coordinates accordingly to make it look real. Just like that. And with that, we've got ourselves the first book. And now there are a few simple techniques to get some variation into that. Simply add in a hue saturation value slider. You can change the hue with that. And to make this random, let's add in an object info node with the random output connected to your hue and a math node connected in between to reduce the effect of this randomness. And if you duplicate the books, you now get some color variation depending on the instance of the book. And next up, you can create one of these shelf compartments by adding some books to it, rotating them along the different axes, moving them back and forth, and scaling them up and down to get a more random look. And this is the key here. And try to add in randomness, because randomness is what nature looks like. And this is very helpful here. This was pretty easy. Now let's focus on our main shelf. There's a cool technique to create this quickly as well. Simply start with a cube, inset the faces, extrude the faces, and then just use an array modifier to duplicate it 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And as for the doors of our shelf, you can simply reuse some of the geometry used earlier and extrude it a bit, bevel the edges a bit, because this makes it look a bit better. And yeah, with that, the array modifier duplicates everything to all the other instances. Pretty simple way to create that. Okay, and for the glass elements, just simply copy a plane and paste it right into place. The individual compartments are created by these wood parts right here, so simply reuse some of the geometry from down below and then simply copy it up by using Shift-R and moving it on the Z-axis. So press Shift-R, and now you've got yourself a small little shelf. It was pretty easy and took only a few minutes. So now let's add detail to the scene. We, for example, added this picture frame right here. Very easy, just a cube, extruded a bit, added this image in the back, and added a glass panel on front. Nothing too fancy here, as well as these parts right here. Just a few simple circles. The same thing is true for the mirror and this small little flower pot, this vase and these glasses right here. All pretty simple and primitive topology, but if you add just enough of that, it looks pretty good. Now let's look at how I created one of these standing lamps. I simply used plane and just used the vertices right here, used Ctrl-Shift-B to bevel the edges, and then I converted everything back into a curve and increased the radius of the curve a bit, which is a pretty easy way to get some complex curve shapes going without going in and fiddling with the Bezier handles and stuff, because this is pretty annoying. We know it all. It's not fun. The same is true for our main lamp, our ceiling lamp. It's just, again, a simple plane, which I converted here into a curve, played around with the thickness of this curve, used Ctrl-Shift-B to bevel the edges, or the vertices in this case, the corners, to create kind of this half circle, and again deleted all the unnecessary topology, converted it into curve, and now I think you get what I'm doing here. As for the light itself, I added in the 3D cursor right here, added in this sphere, gave the sphere this part on top, which I simply used basically the sphere geometry, duplicated it, Control P to separate it into its own object, and with an solidify and bevel modifier, I quickly created these effects. And now I can rotate everything around, and I've got myself a pretty nice ceiling lamp. Nothing too fancy right here. The chair is pretty easy as well. We start off with a plane extruded along its axis, add in a subdivision surface modifier, followed by a solidify modifier quite early on. And now you can go in and increase its strength a bit, maybe apply it and work on this final topology as well to get the shape. It's nothing too fancy. Now let's focus on this rolling part right here. It's just one mesh which is duplicated along a circle. Pretty easy. Now let's start off by adding in our main cube, which I try to position along the x-axis, make the 3D cursor its origin, add in an empty, followed by an array modifier. And for the offset, select object offset and select our array, apply your scale and all the transformations, and then rotate your array or your empty around. And depending on its rotation, you can see you can really move the copies around. And we want 5 copies, so let's simply, for the rotation, enter 360 divided by 5 copies, and you get the right measurement here. And now you have to just worry about one of these parts. Bevel it, add in the rolling element right here and the wheel as well. It's pretty easy right now that you have this instance set up. Now you see me adding this wheel right here. Try to center it, it's very important, and make sure to join it to our main mesh. And then apply everything and go in and add a bit of randomness. Rotate these wheels around a bit. It's very important to make everything random, as I said earlier. Now let's have a look at the door, and especially these profiles, these wooden profiles that go around the door frame. I think by now you know the drill. Just add in a plane, get rid of the faces, and then bevel the corners a bit, and convert everything into a curve. And as for the profile part, you can add in another curve, like this path, for example, and in the main curve settings, as the bevel profile, select this second curve right here. And if we take a look at the side-by-side view, if you then manipulate your main curve, you can create some interesting shapes and profiles pretty easily without going in and extruding stuff. And yeah, it's pretty easy and procedural as well, because you can always go back in and change it to your liking. So I am adding in a bit more topology by subdividing, and with that you can pretty easily create some very complex door frames here. Our door is basically, again, a plane divided into 4 parts, where I deleted 3 of them and used a mirror on the X and Y axis to repeat my my work down there. Now I'm adding in an inset, beveling the edges a bit, again using insets, extruding along the Y axis, again beveling, and yeah, repeat this process to get kind of this door style going. And now you see the mirror does its job and repeats everything around our door. This is how this would look in the end, with just a bit more work. For this lamp right here, it's this very interesting spider-like shape, this metal shape. I'm going to show you quickly how I did that. Start off with a circle, extrude it along the different axes, and with proportional editing, scale it inwards to create this kind of cone-like shape. Add in a subdivision surface modifier to give it a bit more details, and then apply that. And in edit mode, you now can go in and select some of these edge loops right here. Select exactly the shape you want later on. Then simply press Shift D and P to separate into its own object. Delete these back parts right here. And you guessed it, convert everything into a curve and give this curve a bit of thickness. And now you've got yourself this metal grid. Now let's have a look at materials. Pretty easy, nothing fancy right here. As for the couch, we've got ourselves a pretty easy PBR shader set up. I plugged these fabric textures right in. I got my normal maps, my roughness maps. And with the mix color node, I added in some color for the pillows because it's simply the same texture. Again, nothing fancy here. For this little stool right here, we've got a wood texture going. Again, with this mix shader set to soft light or color or something like that to get this kind of paint going. And I reduced the roughness a bit to make it look more shiny, and very important, added this bump material to get these kind of interesting reflections going. Basically the same thing as it is with our door, just that it's just a simple different texture, different material, different PBR material. Nothing fancy here. And for the walls, we've got ourselves this very light concrete materials, just a few irregularities. Not too much, not too overdone, a bit of bump mapping to give a bit of variation and don't make it look too uniform. The door handle is a simple metal material, and our shelf is basically made up of 3 materials, which is the main wood material. It's the same material I used for the stool earlier on, and a natural wood material, maple or something like that. Used a maple texture from textures.com and a glass texture. So pretty simple there. The floor is this very simple wood texture, again downloaded from textures.com. Great resource for that. Our carpet is a carpet texture, which I changed the hue of and added a bit of bump mapping to give it more 3-dimensionality, since I'm just using one texture for that. Yeah, and this chair is basically the same fabric material as our couch. Now I think we're ready to render. Let's make sure all the settings are correct, especially the light paths, and the render layers are very important right here. So diffuse, glossiness, and so on, shadow, ambient occlusion, to have a lot of room to work with in post-processing. You can mix and combine them to get some enhanced looks going. So let's focus on post-processing in Photoshop step by step. As you're used to, these are the different render layers. So you've got yourself a lot of elements to work with. And I did so because I felt like the scene lacked a bit of reflection, especially the door and this shelf right here. So added in the glossiness part, added some ambient occlusion on top to give it a bit more dark look, enhanced the contrast right here, added a bit more brightness to these parts here by using this levels adjustment and this curves adjustment. I added in a bit of contrast to the back parts right here. Yeah, then I increased the brightness of the door a bit. Used the high pass filter to give the scene a bit more micro contrast. So I just combined everything onto one layer, added the high pass filter, and used soft light with a very low opacity to overlay that on top to add some of my of the micro contrast. Here I added a bit more shadows on the floor and on my couch as well. So I used a simple, large, dark brush, drew on my layer and made everything look a bit darker to focus the eye more on the couch rather than the surrounding parts. I increased the saturation a bit and the intensity of this lamp because this was just pretty simple looking. I added in just a blob of color and light there, overlaid that with the screen blending mode. And again, I added in some of the reflections and the lighting on my couch, on my scene, by simply adding a blob of color right there and overlaying that with the soft light or overlay blend mode. To quickly get a cool look going, I used the color lookup tables right in Photoshop, added different templates right here and used different opacities and strengths to overlay that on top. Yeah, right here, added some reflections and increased the overall lightness on the left side, because on the left side there is the window and we want more light to come in through this window. So added a kind of yellowish color there, used the screen blend mode on a very, very low opacity to add kind of a diffuse glow on the left side. Again, on the right hand side, I added a bit of vignette and increased the darkness right there. I increased the darkest and lightest part on my sofa as well, used the soft light blending mode to overlay that on top to get kind of a color dodging and burning going. And yeah, with that layer, I decreased the light intensity on the wall, but increased it on the mirror because that was a bit too dark. Here I fixed some of the darkest shading on the couch as well, because I felt that was a bit too dark. And here I again added in some color lookup tables, followed by levels adjustment, where I crushed the whites a bit, increased the saturation, again added in a color lookup. Now going back to the lamp, I increased its intensity and the intensity of light which is cast on to the couch by simply drawing with a brush on my couch in this orangish, very light color, and using these blend modes in the layer settings to exclude them from the darkest parts. So wherever it's light, the color gets applied and the darkest parts are not as intense. Here I'm using some dodging and burning again to further give it this semi-micro contrast and make it pop really out. Now here I again focused on this middle part because I felt that it was too dark for my taste. Yeah, here I increased the main exposure because it was a bit too dark, and desaturated a bit because I felt it was too saturated, and focused the eye more on the couch by drawing a large vignette on top, using hue and saturation to increase it back again, and yeah, this final contrast adjustment. And with that, this is our final image. So let's have a look at the before and after, and I think this looks pretty cool. If you're interested in the project files for this tutorial, just go to patreon.com/rescan to get access to all the project files for this and all the other tutorials. So with that said, thanks again for watching and see you next time.